The golden California sun was setting over Beverly Hills, casting long shadows across Rodeo Drive's pristine sidewalks. Jim Carrey, one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, had just finished a meeting with his agent at the Creative Artists Agency building. Unlike many celebrities who rushed from their meetings to waiting limousines, Jim preferred to walk when possible. It helped him stay grounded, he'd often say, in a city where reality could sometimes feel like a movie set. Dressed in worn blue jeans and a simple gray t-shirt, he blended surprisingly well with the evening crowd. His naturally expressive face was relaxed, his thoughts drifting to the script he'd just discussed, another potential comedy that would let him make millions laugh. But fate had different plans for his evening, ones that would remind him why he fell in love with making people smile in the first place. As he approached LeBlanc, one of Beverly Hills' most exclusive restaurants, something caught his eye. In the narrow alley between the restaurant and a high-end boutique, an elderly man was carefully going through a garbage bin. The scene created a jarring contrast with the luxury surrounding it. Designer stores, expensive cars, and well-dressed people passing by, most averting their eyes from what they considered an uncomfortable sight. Jim stopped walking. He'd seen homelessness before. It was impossible not to in Los Angeles. But something about this man's methodical, almost dignified approach to his desperate situation struck a chord. The elderly man wore what had once been proper attire, a threadbare tweed jacket with patches at the elbows, khaki pants now frayed at the edges, and scuffed leather shoes that had clearly been resoled multiple times. A small worn backpack sat carefully placed against the wall, its straps holding together by what seemed to be sheer willpower. "Finding anything interesting?" Jim asked, approaching slowly so as not to startle the man. The elderly gentleman straightened up, his movements careful and deliberate. His face, weathered by time and hardship, still maintained a spark of dignity in his clear blue eyes. "Just looking for my next meal," he replied with an unexpected hint of educated articulation. "Though I must say, LeBlanc's garbage is considerably more refined than most." Jim couldn't help but smile at the man's ability to find humor in his situation. "I'm Jim," he said, extending his hand. "Thomas," the man replied, wiping his hand on his jacket before shaking Jim's. "Thomas Winchester. And yes, I know who you are, Mr. Carrey. The Mask was a particular favorite of my students before. The trailing off of Thomas's voice, the slight slump of his shoulders, spoke volumes about a life that had taken unexpected turns. Jim noticed how Thomas's accent and vocabulary suggested an educated background. This wasn't someone who had always lived on the streets. Looking at the prestigious LeBlanc restaurant, with its elegant facade and valet parking service, Jim made a spontaneous decision. "Thomas, how would you like to have dinner with me? And I don't mean from the garbage bin." Thomas's eyes widened slightly, darting between Jim and the restaurant's entrance. "That's very kind, Mr. Carrey, but I don't think they'd welcome someone like me in there. Places like LeBlanc have a certain standard to maintain." Jim's characteristic grin spread across his face, but there was determination in his eyes. "Standards? Let me tell you something about standards, Thomas. True standards aren't about what someone wears or how much money they have. They're about human dignity. And from where I'm standing, you've shown more dignity in going through that garbage than half the people I've met at Hollywood parties." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Tell you what, I have a reservation for later tonight anyway. Let me just move it up." As he made the call, Jim watched Thomas carefully collect his backpack, attempting to brush off some of the dirt from his clothes. "Mr. Carrey," Thomas said hesitantly, "I appreciate the gesture, but I haven't been in a place like that it's been years. I wouldn't know how to." Jim put his phone away and placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Just be yourself. That's all anyone can ever really be. Besides, I'm Jim Carrey. They expect a little unconventional from me." He winked, bringing a small smile to Thomas's face. As they walked toward the restaurant's entrance, Jim noticed how Thomas straightened his posture, as if muscle memory from a different life was kicking in. There was something both heartbreaking and inspiring about watching this man attempt to reclaim a dignity that society had tried to strip away from him. "You mentioned students earlier," Jim said as they approached the door. "Were you a teacher?" Thomas nodded, his eyes taking on a distant look. "Professor of literature at UCLA. For 30 years, I taught students about the power of stories to change lives. Never imagined I'd end up being the kind of character I used to teach about. The fallen man, the victim of circumstance, the man about to have the best damn dinner in Beverly Hills," Jim interrupted, his voice carrying that perfect blend of humor and kindness that had made him famous. "And maybe, just maybe, help teach a few more people about the power of stories to change lives." As they reached the restaurant's ornate entrance, neither man could have predicted how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how the next few hours would transform not just their evening, but the lives of everyone involved in what was about to unfold at LeBlanc. LeBlanc's elegant foyer glowed with warmth from crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off marble floors polished to mirror-like perfection. The restaurant had earned its reputation as one of Beverly Hills' crown jewels, where celebrities and business moguls would spend thousands on a single meal. The air was perfumed with the subtle fragrance of fresh flowers and expensive wine, creating an atmosphere of exclusivity that Robert Whitmore, the maitre d', had carefully cultivated over his 15 years of service. At 52, Robert took immense pride in maintaining LeBlanc's prestigious standards. His silver-streaked hair was always immaculately styled, his black suit pressed to perfection, and his posture remained military straight throughout his 12-hour shifts. He ran the front of house like a conductor leads an orchestra, with precise movements and uncompromising attention to detail. That Thursday evening had been relatively quiet, just the way Robert preferred it. He had just finished arranging the reservation book when movement at the entrance caught his eye. The sight nearly made him drop his Mont Blanc pen. A disheveled elderly man in ragged clothing was actually stepping onto LeBlanc's imported Italian marble. Robert's face contorted into an expression of disgusted disbelief as he watched the man's scuffed shoes leave faint marks on the pristine floor. The intruder's appearance was an assault on everything LeBlanc represented. His tweed jacket was patched and frayed, his pants were wrinkled, and he carried a worn backpack that looked like it had been salvaged from a dumpster. What Robert didn't notice was Jim Carrey deliberately hanging back in the shadows of the entrance, watching intently. The actor had quietly asked Thomas to enter first, wanting to see how the restaurant staff would treat someone they perceived as homeless. Jim already suspected what might happen, but he needed to witness it firsthand. Robert swooped across the foyer with the speed and precision of a hawk targeting its prey. Several other staff members stopped what they were doing to watch, their faces showing varying degrees of discomfort and silent complicity. Sarah, a young hostess, took a half-step forward, as if to intervene, but quickly thought better of it when she saw Robert's expression. "Sir?" Robert's voice dripped with disdain, each word carefully enunciated, as if speaking to someone particularly slow-witted. "This is a high-end establishment. We don't serve your kind here." His hand made a dismissive flicking gesture toward the door, like someone shooing away an unwanted stray cat. Thomas, standing straighter than one might expect, cleared his throat. "I understand your concern, but I've been invited to dine here this evening." His educated tone seemed to further irritate Robert, as if the proper speech pattern coming from someone so shabby was a personal affront. Robert's laugh was sharp and cruel, echoing off the marble walls. "Invited? Really?" He made a show of looking around the empty foyer. "By whom exactly?" "The President of the United States." Several of the watching staff members snickered, though a few looked away, shamefaced. Thomas maintained his dignity, though his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Actually, I'm here as a dinner guest of—" "Listen," Robert cut him off, taking a step closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I don't know what scam you're trying to pull, but I suggest you leave now, before I'm forced to call security. This isn't some soup kitchen or homeless shelter. People pay thousands of dollars to dine here. They don't come to LeBlanc to eat their foie gras next to someone who smells like they just crawled out of a dumpster." The cruelty of the words hung in the air like poison. Thomas's shoulders slumped slightly, the proud posture he'd maintained beginning to crumble under the weight of the public humiliation. Behind him, Jim Carrey's face had transformed from its usual jovial expression to one of stone-cold seriousness. "I assure you," Thomas tried one last time, his voice quieter now. "I was invited by—" "Oh, please do tell us," Robert interrupted again, his voice rising theatrically as he turned to address his audience of staff members. "Who would invite someone like you to LeBlanc? Perhaps George Clooney? Or maybe Brad Pitt? No, wait, I know. It must have been the Queen of England herself. The sarcasm was so thick it could have been cut with one of Leblanc's expensive steak knives. A few of the staff members laughed nervously, while others began to look increasingly uncomfortable with their manager's behavior. Sarah, the young hostess, was now staring at her shoes, her face red with second-hand embarrassment. Robert turned back to Thomas, all pretense of civility gone. "We have real guests arriving soon, and I won't have them subjected to this." He gestured at Thomas's entire person with undisguised revulsion. "Now, I suggest you shuffle back to whatever street corner you came from Before you what, Robert?" The new voice, clear and commanding, cut through the tension like a thunderclap. Jim Carrey stepped out of the shadows, his casual clothing suddenly seeming more like a deliberate choice than a fashion statement. The effect on the room was immediate and electric. Robert's face, which had been flushed with self-righteous anger, drained of all color. The staff members who had been snickering moments before froze in horror. Sarah, the hostess, actually gasped out loud. The foyer of Leblanc, which had just witnessed one of the ugliest displays of human behavior, was about to become the stage for something entirely different. And Jim Carrey, known worldwide for making people laugh, was not wearing his comic mask tonight. In fact, he had never looked more serious in his life. The atmosphere in Leblanc's foyer crystallized into something almost tangible as Jim Carrey stepped forward, his presence transforming the space from an exclusive restaurant into what felt like a courtroom of moral judgment. The actor's normally playful features were set in lines of stern disappointment, his eyes carrying a weight that made Robert, the previously imperious maître d', take an involuntary step backward. Actually, Jim's voice carried that rare gravity that reminded everyone present that behind the comedian's mask was a man of profound depth. "He's here as my personal guest." Each word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples of realization through the assembled staff. Robert's face performed a remarkable transformation, from smug superiority to horrified recognition in the span of seconds. The color drained from his cheeks so quickly that he looked like he might faint. His mouth opened and closed several times, resembling nothing so much as a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. "Mr. Carrey, I had no idea. Please, let me—" Robert's words tumbled over each other in his rush to backpedal. His hands fluttered nervously, straightening his already perfectly straight tie, a gesture of pure anxiety. "Had I known he was with you, please, let me show you both to our finest table." Jim raised his hand, the simple gesture silencing Robert's stammering as effectively as if he'd shouted. The actor's next words came out measured and deliberate, each syllable weighted with purpose. "It's not me you owe an explanation to, Robert." He gestured toward Thomas, who stood quietly maintaining his dignity despite the humiliation he'd just endured. "It's this man, this human being, whom you judged without knowing a single thing about his story." The silence that followed was deafening. The restaurant staff, who moments ago had been complicit spectators to Robert's cruelty, now looked anywhere but at the scene unfolding before them. Sarah, the young hostess, had tears forming in her eyes. "You know what I find interesting?" Jim continued, his voice taking on a teaching tone that commanded attention. "In all your years of working here, serving the wealthy and famous, you've probably seen countless examples of horrible behavior. Rich people treating servers like dirt, celebrities throwing tantrums over cold soup, business tycoons making their dates cry over wine selections." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I bet none of them left marks on your precious marble floor that bothered you as much as the scuffs from this man's shoes." Robert flinched as if he'd been slapped. His earlier concern about the floor marks now seemed not just petty but morally repugnant. I'm sorry," Robert managed to whisper, though his eyes were still fixed on Jim rather than Thomas. "Still not looking at him," Jim observed, his voice carrying an edge of disappointment. "Still talking to me instead of him. Why is that, Robert? Is it because I'm famous? Because I could probably buy this restaurant if I wanted to? Or is it because acknowledging him as a human being equal to yourself would force you to confront some uncomfortable truths about how you view the world?" The questions hung in the air like physical things. Several of the staff members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own prejudices in Jim's words. Sarah, the hostess, had now moved closer to Thomas, as if trying to demonstrate through proximity that she wasn't part of the cruel judgment he'd faced. Perhaps, Jim continued, his voice softening slightly, we should all remember that every person who walks through these doors, through any doors, has a story. They have dreams, memories, people they've loved, students they've taught. He glanced meaningfully at Thomas, making it clear he'd heard their earlier conversation. The price of their clothes or the state of their shoes doesn't determine their worth as human beings. Robert finally turned to face Thomas directly, his face a mask of shame. Sir, he began, his voice trembling slightly. There's no excuse for my behavior. None. I was cruel, judgmental, and completely unprofessional. More than that, I was inhuman. I can only offer my most sincere apologies. Thomas nodded quietly, his dignified response making Robert's previous behavior seem even more shameful by contrast. Jim placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. What do you say we get that dinner now? I hear the chef here does amazing things with truffle sauce. He turned to Robert, his expression serious but not unkind. That is, unless there are any objections to us dining here tonight? No, of course not. Robert practically stumbled over his words. Please, let me personally ensure that your evening is perfect. I'll have the kitchen prepare our finest. What we'd like, Jim interrupted firmly, is to be treated exactly like any other guests. No special treatment, no excessive attention. Just two human beings having dinner together. Can you manage that, Robert? The question carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on anyone present. Robert straightened his posture, making a visible effort to gather his professional dignity around him like a shield. Yes, Mr. Carrey. Please, follow me to your table. As they walked through the restaurant, other diners began to recognize Jim Carrey, but something in his demeanor, and perhaps the unusual nature of his dinner companion, kept them from making a fuss. The evening was about to become something more than just another dinner service at LeBlanc. It was about to become a lesson in humanity that none of the present would ever forget. As Jim and Thomas settled into their elegantly appointed table at LeBlanc, the restaurant's atmosphere had shifted noticeably. The usual quiet murmur of expensive silverware against fine china was punctuated by curious glances and whispered conversations. Word of what had transpired in the foyer had spread quickly among both staff and patrons, creating an almost electric anticipation in the air. Robert, still visibly shaken by the earlier confrontation, personally poured water into their crystal glasses with trembling hands. Jim noticed how the maitre d' was now making a conscious effort to look Thomas in the eye, though shame made it difficult for him to maintain the contact for long. Would you gentlemen like to hear tonight's specials? Robert asked, his usually confident voice barely above a whisper. Before Jim could respond, Thomas spoke up. Actually, Robert, I'd prefer if you would sit with us for a moment. The request, delivered with such gentle authority, surprised everyone, especially Robert, whose professional composure cracked slightly at the unexpected invitation. Jim smiled, immediately understanding Thomas's intention. Yes, please join us. And perhaps, he glanced around at the other staff members who were trying their best to look busy, while obviously listening in. Perhaps your colleagues would like to join us as well. I think we all could benefit from hearing what Thomas has to share. The next few minutes saw an unprecedented gathering in LeBlanc's history. Sarah, the young hostess, brought over a chair first, followed by other servers, busboys, and even two curious sous chefs who had emerged from the kitchen. They formed a small semicircle around the table, their faces a mixture of uncertainty and intrigue. Thomas took a slow sip of water, his hands steady, despite the emotion visible in his eyes. 30 years ago, he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a seasoned lecturer, I stood in front of my first class at UCLA's Department of Literature. I remember being terrified, but also exhilarated. I was about to teach young minds about the power of stories, about how literature shapes our understanding of the human condition. He paused, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. My specialty was tragic heroes, characters who fall from grace not through any inherent evil, but through the cruel machinations of fate. I never imagined I would become one of them. The restaurant staff listened intently as Thomas continued. For 3 decades, I lived what many would consider the American dream. I had a beautiful wife, Margaret, who taught music at a local high school. We had a lovely home in Pasadena, filled with books and the sound of her piano. Our students would often visit for dinner discussions that would last late into the night. Life was perfect. His voice caught slightly on the last word, and Jim gently placed a hand on his shoulder, encouraging him to continue. Then Margaret started forgetting things. Small things at first. Where she'd put her keys, what day it was. We joked about it. But then she forgot how to play Chopin's nocturnes, pieces she'd performed thousands of times. The diagnosis came soon after, early onset Alzheimer's. A collective intake of breath from the gathered staff punctuated the silence. Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek. I took early retirement to care for her. Our savings went to experimental treatments, then to nursing care when I could no longer manage alone. After she passed, I discovered that our insurance had denied coverage for most of the treatments, claiming they were experimental. The medical bills. Thomas shook his head slowly. Well, let's just say that literature professors' salaries and retirement funds aren't designed to handle hundreds of thousands in medical debt. Robert, who had been standing rigidly throughout the story, sank slowly into a chair, his face ashen. But surely the university had policies. Thomas finished for him. Very clear policies about medical coverage and retirement benefits. All perfectly legal, all perfectly logical, all perfectly inhuman. He straightened his worn tweed jacket with dignity. Within 2 years, I had sold our home, then our car, then my books. That was the hardest part, watching my library disappear piece by piece. But even that wasn't enough. Jim, who had been listening intently, spoke softly. Yet here you are, still teaching. Thomas looked at him questioningly. Everything you've said, every word you've spoken, has been a lesson, Jim explained. About dignity, about resilience, about the way life can change in an instant, about how the line between professor and homeless man is thinner than most people realize. Thomas nodded slowly. You know what I tell myself every morning, when I wake up wherever I've managed to find shelter. He looked around at the gathered faces. I say, they can take my home, they can take my books, they can take my position, but they cannot take my dignity unless I give it to them. Some days, that's harder to believe than others, especially when people look at you like you're invisible, or worse, like you're something unpleasant they've stepped in. Robert flinched visibly at these words, remembering his own behavior earlier. But you know what's remarkable? Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. Even in my current situation, I still find myself teaching. Sometimes it's to other homeless people, sharing stories from the books I once owned. Sometimes it's to young runaways, trying to convince them to return home or seek help. The classroom has changed, but the lesson remains the same. Every human being has value, every story matters, and dignity isn't something that can be measured by the size of one's bank account or the address on one's mailbox, or lack thereof. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of sniffling from several of the staff members. Jim Carrey, master of transformation himself, looked at Thomas with newfound respect, understanding that here was a man who had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all, from society's heights to its depths, while maintaining his essential self intact. The remainder of that evening at LeBlanc unfolded like a masterfully written play, where every scene seemed to build upon the last, towards something greater than anyone could have anticipated. After Thomas shared his story, Jim Carrey did something characteristic of his generous spirit, but unprecedented in the restaurant's history. He asked the chef to prepare a feast, not just for himself and Thomas, but for every staff member present. Tonight, Jim announced, we break bread together, not as servers and customers or rich and poor, but as human beings sharing a meal and learning from each other. The kitchen staff outdid themselves, preparing course after exquisite course, served family style on tables hastily pushed together in the main dining room. As they dined, the conversations flowed naturally, barriers breaking down with each passing moment. Thomas, now comfortable in his element as an educator, began sharing insights about literature that connected deeply with everyone present. He spoke about Victor Hugo's Les Misérables and its themes of redemption, drawing subtle but clear parallels to the evening's events that made Robert blush with self-recognition. It was during the dessert course that Jim Carrey leaned back in his chair, watching the scene before him with thoughtful eyes. You know, he said, loud enough to catch everyone's attention, this feels right. This feels like what a restaurant should be. Not just a place to eat, but a place to nourish both body and soul. Robert, who had been quietly contemplating throughout the meal, suddenly straightened up. "Mr. Carrey, I have a proposal." His voice trembled slightly, but there was determination in his eyes. "What if we made this a regular occurrence at LeBlanc? Not exactly like tonight, but something similar. One night a week, we could open our doors to those who couldn't normally afford to dine here." The suggestion hung in the air for a moment, before Jim's face broke into his famous grin. "Now that's the kind of thinking I love to hear. But why stop there?" He turned to Thomas. "And what if we combined fine dining with education? Thomas, would you be interested in sharing your knowledge more formally?" What followed was an hour of intense planning and discussion. The program that emerged would become known as Dignity Dinners. Every Monday night, LeBlanc would serve free meals to a select number of homeless individuals, treating them with the same impeccable service offered to their wealthy clientele. But more than that, Thomas would conduct informal literature discussions during these dinners, creating a unique blend of physical and intellectual nourishment. Robert, in a complete transformation from his earlier behavior, became the program's most passionate advocate. "We'll need to coordinate with local shelters," he began planning out loud. His organizational skills now turned to a noble purpose. "We'll need to ensure we have proper facilities for our guests to freshen up before dinner, perhaps partner with local clothing donors." Sarah, the young hostess, jumped in with her own suggestions about making guests feel welcome, while the kitchen staff began discussing how to create nutritious, yet elegant menus that would work within the program's constraints. The energy in the room was electric with possibility. Jim watched all this with satisfaction, but he wasn't done yet. "I'll make you a deal," he announced. "For every night you run this program, I'll match the cost of the meals and donations to local homeless shelters. And I'll spread the word among my colleagues. Maybe we can get other restaurants to start similar programs." Thomas, who had been quietly observing this transformation of LeBlanc, finally spoke up. "You know what strikes me about all this?" he said, his professor's voice carrying easily across the room. "In literature, we often talk about the moment of recognition, the point where a character suddenly sees truth and is forever changed by it. Tonight I've witnessed that moment happening in real life, and it's more powerful than any story I've ever taught." As the evening drew to a close, Jim Carrey stood to make one final observation. His face, usually animated with comedy, showed the serious thoughtfulness that those who knew him well recognized as his true nature. "We all wear masks in life," he began, looking around the room. "I've made a career out of wearing them, making people laugh by becoming different characters. But tonight has reminded me of something crucial. The most important thing isn't the mask we wear, but our willingness to see behind the masks of others." He gestured to the gathered staff, to Thomas, to the elegant room around them. "Some masks are made of designer clothes and professional titles. Some are made of poverty and hardship. But behind every mask is a human being with a story worth hearing and dignity worth respecting. That's what LeBlanc will stand for from now on. Not just excellent food, but excellence in humanity." The change in LeBlanc was immediate and lasting. Within weeks, the Dignity Dinners program became known throughout Los Angeles, inspiring similar initiatives at other restaurants. Thomas, no longer homeless thanks to a job offer from LeBlanc as their resident literature instructor, now splits his time between teaching staff and guests, sharing the wisdom of great books with anyone willing to listen. Robert, transformed by that night's events, became known not just for his impeccable service, but for his compassion. He personally greets every Dignity Dinner guest, ensuring they feel as welcome as any celebrity patron. The restaurant's reputation grew not just for its cuisine, but for its heart. And if you visit LeBlanc today, you'll notice something unusual near the entrance. A framed quote from Jim Carrey, written on the night that changed everything. "True elegance isn't found in crystal glasses or silver spoons, but in how we recognize and honor the dignity in every human being who walks through our doors."